I won't do it. Chisholm's voice cracked as she stared across the polished conference table. Her hands trembled so badly she had to hide them beneath her worn grey cardigan. You don't have a choice, the woman across from her replied without looking up from the stack of legal papers. I said no. The woman finally lifted her eyes. Cold. Unmoved. You owe St. Catherine Medical Center $83,000 for your mother's treatment. Your mother's gone, Chisholm. The debt isn't. The words hit harder than any slap. Chisholm swallowed, trying to steady her breathing. My mother worked her whole life. She never would have wanted this. No one asks what the dead want. Silence filled the room. Then the woman pushed a single contract toward her. Marry him. Chisholm frowned. Who? Obinna Okafor. Her eyebrows knitted together. The billionaire. The heir to the Okafor Group. The man who's been in a coma for 3 years? Yes. Chisholm stared as if she'd misheard. You're asking me to marry an unconscious man? I'm telling you. The woman folded her hands. If you sign these papers today, every cent of your debt disappears. And if I don't, you'll lose your apartment within the month. A long silence followed. Then came the sentence that changed Chisholm's life forever. You won't even be using your own name. She blinked. What? From this moment forward, you'll legally become Adiz Nwosu. My name is Chisholm Ease. Not anymore. 3 days earlier, Chisholm never imagined a housekeeping uniform would become the only thing standing between her and homelessness. At 26, she cleaned rooms at the prestigious Royal Crescent Medical Center in downtown Atlanta. Doctors barely noticed her. Patients rarely remembered her name. She quietly changed bed sheets, disinfected equipment, emptied trash cans, and disappeared before anyone could thank her. That invisibility had become her survival. Every paycheck vanished almost instantly. Rent, utilities, groceries, monthly payments toward the crushing medical debt left behind after her mother, Grace Ease, lost a battle with ovarian cancer. Sometimes Chisholm skipped dinner just to keep the lights on. Yet every morning she still smiled at strangers. Not because life was easy. Because kindness cost nothing. One rainy Tuesday evening, she was mopping the private rehabilitation wing when she noticed a nurse crying near room 701. You okay? Chisholm asked softly. The nurse wiped her face. He's still the same. Who? The CEO. Chisholm glanced through the glass window. Inside lay a tall man surrounded by expensive medical equipment. Dark hair. Strong jawline. Broad shoulders. He looked asleep. Peaceful. Almost unreal. That's Obinna Okafor. The nurse nodded. They've flown specialists in from Switzerland, Japan, Germany. And no change. What happened to him? Car accident. The nurse lowered her voice. Some people think it wasn't an accident. Before Chisholm could ask another question, the nurse hurried away. She looked back at the sleeping man. For reasons she couldn't explain. She felt sorry for him. Not because he was rich. Because he looked alone. Over the next several weeks, room 701 became part of Chisholm's cleaning assignment. Most employees rushed through. She never did. Morning, Mr. Okafor. She always greeted him. Even though everyone said he couldn't hear. She opened the curtains every morning. Adjusted the flowers. Played soft jazz from the hospital television whenever no one else was around. I heard rain's finally stopping today. She laughed quietly. You probably don't care. She straightened his blanket. But if you wake up, Atlanta actually has nice sunsets. No answer. She expected none. Still. She talked. Sometimes about work. Sometimes about memories of her mother. Sometimes about absolutely nothing. I burned toast again. She smiled. I seriously think toast hates me. The room felt less lonely somehow. Across town. Inside the 48th floor boardroom of Okafor Group headquarters, an emergency family meeting was underway. Around the polished table sat members of one of America's wealthiest families. No one smiled. If Obinna dies unmarried, one older executive said, control shifts according to his father's will. Another nodded. And that's unacceptable. Vivian Okafor slowly removed her diamond glasses. Elegant. Calculating. Feared by nearly everyone in the company. As Obinna's stepmother, she'd spent the last 3 years quietly expanding her influence while her stepson remained unconscious. Now, a legal deadline threatened everything. The trustees require a lawful spouse, the family attorney explained. Without one. He hesitated. Obinna's shares enter temporary independent control. Vivian's eyes narrowed. We're not allowing outsiders near this company. What about your niece? Someone asked. Vivian scoffed. Why would I sacrifice my own family? The room fell silent. Then one director spoke carefully. What if someone disposable married him? Vivian slowly smiled. Not warmly. Dangerously. The search began that same night. Not for love. Not for compatibility. For someone invisible. Someone desperate enough not to ask questions. Someone whose disappearance no one would notice. By morning, a private investigator slid a thin folder across Vivian's desk. On the cover was a simple employee ID photo. Name: Chisholm Ease. Occupation: hospital housekeeping staff. No criminal history. No close relatives. Mother deceased. Crippling medical debt. Vivian closed the folder. Perfect. 2 days later, Chisholm received a phone call ordering her to report to the hospital's executive administration office. She assumed she'd made a mistake. Maybe she'd broken expensive equipment. Maybe she was being fired. Instead, she found 3 lawyers waiting. None of them smile. One man simply asked, Miss Ease, how much is your future worth? She didn't yet realize that before the week was over, she'd walked down the aisle beside a man who couldn't even open his eyes, while carrying a name that wasn't hers, becoming the centerpiece of a scheme built on lies that powerful people would kill to protect. Chisholm barely slept after leaving the administration office. She sat alone in her tiny apartment, the unsigned contract lying on the kitchen table beside a stack of overdue bills. Every few minutes, she looked at a framed picture of her mother. Grace Ease had been the kind of woman who believed every problem had an honest solution. Never let desperation decide your character, she used to say. Chisholm whispered toward the photo. I'm trying, Mama. Tears rolled down her cheeks. But I don't know what else to do. The eviction notice hanging on her refrigerator fluttered as the air conditioner rattled. She had 12 days before the landlord could legally remove her. The collection agencies called every morning. The hospital debt grew with interest every month. She'd already sold her mother's jewelry, her old car, even the piano Grace had taught neighborhood kids to play. There was nothing left. Nothing except her name. And now they wanted that too. The following afternoon, a sleek black SUV stopped outside her apartment building. Neighbors peeked through cracked curtains. Children stopped riding their bikes. No one had ever seen a vehicle like that on their street. A man in an expensive navy suit stepped out. Miss Ease. She nodded cautiously. I'm Daniel Brooks, personal attorney for the Okafor family. He opened the passenger door. Mrs. Vivian Okafor would like to speak with you. I already gave them my answer. You didn't. I said I wasn't interested. You said you needed time. Daniel looked at her gently. And judging by your landlord's notice taped to the front door. He glanced toward the peeling paper. Time is exactly what you don't have. The Okafor estate looked more like a luxury resort than a home. Iron gates stretched nearly a quarter-mile. Perfectly trimmed gardens surrounded a sprawling mansion of stone and glass. Inside, Chisholm felt completely out of place. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers. Paintings worth more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes lined the walls. A maid offered her tea. She almost laughed. "I'm usually the one serving it." The maid smiled sympathetically. "I know." Before Chisholm could ask what she meant, another employee escorted her upstairs. At the end of a long hallway stood Vivian Okafor. She wore an ivory pantsuit that looked effortlessly elegant. Every movement seemed calculated. "Mrs. It's Chisholm. For now." Vivian motioned toward a private sitting room. "I'll be honest. I don't like wasting time." "I don't either." "Good." Vivian folded her hands. "My stepson requires a legal wife." "I'm aware. You require financial freedom. I'm not looking to sell myself." "No." Vivian smiled faintly. "You're selling a signature." Chisholm's jaw tightened. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Vivian slid another folder across the coffee table. Inside were copies of every debt. Every missed payment. Every collection notice. Every late utility bill. Chisholm's face flushed. "You investigated me." "I investigate everyone." Vivian leaned forward. "I also investigated your mother." That sentence made Chisholm sit upright. "What about her?" "She volunteered at shelters." "Yes." "She paid strangers' grocery bills." "She did." "She worked 3 jobs." Chisholm nodded proudly. "She raised an honest daughter." Vivian paused. "Would she want that daughter sleeping in her car?" Silence. "Would she want creditors taking everything she left behind?" More silence. Then Vivian delivered the offer again. "You'll marry Obinna. You'll live comfortably. You'll never owe another dollar. And when he wakes up?" Vivian answered without hesitation. "He won't." Those 4 words echoed in Chisholm's mind. "He won't." Not if, but won't. There was something unsettling about the certainty in Vivian's voice. Almost as if she wasn't making a prediction. She was stating a fact. Before leaving, Chisholm made one request. "I want to see him." Vivian hesitated. "Why?" "If I'm supposed to become his wife." She swallowed. "I'd like to meet him." Vivian exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. Finally she nodded. 5 minutes. Obinna's private suite inside the estate was unlike any hospital room. Advanced medical equipment lined one wall. A rehabilitation gym occupied another. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a peaceful lake. The room smelled faintly of cedar and clean linen. Obinna lay exactly as he had at the hospital. Still. Silent. Unaware. Without the fluorescent hospital lights, he somehow looked younger. Less like a billionaire. More like a man whose life had simply stopped. Chisholm walked closer. She noticed tiny scars near his hairline. A faded bruise along one shoulder. His left hand rested outside the blanket. Without thinking, she gently tucked it back under. "You'll catch a chill." Daniel watched from the doorway. "You know he can't feel that." "Maybe." She smiled sadly. "But I can." She pulled a chair beside the bed. "Hi." No response. "I'm Chisholm." She laughed awkwardly. "I guess introductions are strange when only one person's awake." She looked around. "This room is beautiful." Then she looked back at him. "But it feels lonely." For nearly 5 minutes she simply talked. About traffic. About the old woman she'd helped carry groceries that morning. About how difficult it was keeping plants alive. Daniel checked his watch. "It's time." As Chisholm stood to leave, she noticed something unusual. Obinna's heart monitor briefly climbed. Not dangerously. Just faster. The nurse glanced at the screen. Probably random. But Chisholm couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That evening, Daniel returned to Vivian's office. "Well?" Vivian asked. She spoke to him. And the monitor reacted. Vivian frowned. Coincidence? Maybe. Daniel hesitated. But none of the specialists have seen that response in months. Vivian's expression hardened. I didn't hire her to heal him. No. You hired her to keep control of the company. She didn't deny it. Instead, she quietly asked, has the identity transfer been completed? Almost. The real Adiz Nwosu? She signed the confidentiality agreement yesterday. Vivian smiled. Excellent. Daniel shifted uneasily. I still don't understand why we need another woman's name. Vivian stood and walked toward the window overlooking Atlanta's skyline. Because if anything goes wrong. She spoke without turning around. Chisholm Ease must disappear. The next morning, Chisholm received a small envelope delivered by courier. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Obinna laughing beside a beautiful young woman with long braids and bright eyes. Written on the back, in elegant handwriting, were the words, "Forever yours, Adiz." Chisholm stared at the name. Adiz. The very identity Vivian wanted her to become. Her pulse quickened. If Adiz already existed, then who exactly was she being asked to pretend to be? And why had the woman disappeared just before the wedding? Chisholm couldn't stop staring at the photograph. The smiling woman beside Obinna looked genuinely in love. There was nothing fake about the way they looked at each other. She carried the picture in her purse for 3 days before finally asking Daniel the question that had been haunting her. Who is the real Adiz? Daniel froze. I can't answer that. You can. I shouldn't. Everyone keeps telling me to lie. Just one person. Tell me the truth. Daniel let out a long breath. The woman in that picture was Obinna's fiancée. What happened to her? She disappeared 2 weeks before the accident. Disappeared. No one ever found her. Chisholm's heart sank. And Vivian had me take her place. Daniel looked away. Yes. Despite everything, Chisholm honored the marriage. Not because it felt real, but because she believed every human being deserved dignity. She read books to Obinna every evening. She massaged his hands and arms during physical therapy. She made sure his favorite jazz playlist stayed on, even though no one knew whether he could hear it. The nurses began noticing small changes. His fingers twitched. His heartbeat steadied whenever Chisholm spoke. His brain activity slowly improved. The doctors remained cautious. It could still mean nothing. But Chisholm refused to give up. One evening she held his hand and whispered, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm done pretending to be someone else. My name is Chisholm. I wasn't supposed to tell you. They wanted you to believe I was Adiz. A tear slipped down her cheek. I'm sorry. The room remained silent. Then, she felt it. A gentle squeeze. She looked down. Obinna's fingers were wrapped around hers. Within 48 hours, the impossible happened. Obinna opened his eyes. Doctors rushed into the room. Machines beeped. Nurses called specialists. After 3 years, Atlanta's most famous patient was awake. The first face he searched for wasn't Vivian's. It wasn't the doctor's. It was Chisholm's. His voice was weak. Who are you? She smiled through tears. My name is Chisholm. Not Adiz. Not anymore. Recovery was slow. Obinna couldn't remember everything. But fragments returned each day. The accident. The argument. The rain. Then one memory shattered everything. It wasn't an accident. The room fell silent. I remember the brakes failing. They were cut. A criminal investigation reopened immediately. Financial records surfaced. Security footage that had mysteriously vanished was recovered from an old backup server. A former mechanic confessed he had been paid to sabotage Obinna's car. The money trail led straight to Vivian's financial advisor. When investigators questioned Vivian, her carefully built story began to crumble. She had never planned to kill Obinna. She had only wanted him permanently unable to run the company. As long as he remained unconscious, she controlled billions of dollars in corporate assets. The forced marriage had simply been another move to keep that control. Weeks later, Vivian was arrested on charges that included conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, identity fraud, and attempted murder. For the first time in years, the Okafor family faced the truth instead of hiding behind wealth. One mystery remained. What happened to the real Adiz? Months into the investigation, detectives finally found her living quietly in Portugal under a different name. She had fled after discovering evidence that someone inside the family intended to harm Obinna. Fearing for her own life, she disappeared without telling anyone. When she learned Obinna was alive, she returned voluntarily. The reunion was emotional. She hugged him tightly. "I'm sorry I ran." Obinna smiled sadly. "You were trying to survive." Adiz looked toward Chisholm. "So, you're the woman who refused to give up on him." Chisholm nodded. "I only did what anyone should have done." Adiz smiled warmly. "No. You loved him before he could love you back." She wished them both happiness before quietly returning to the life she had built overseas. There was no bitterness. Only gratitude that the truth had finally come out. One afternoon, months later, Obinna invited Chisholm to the small community park where she used to eat lunch during her housekeeping shifts. There were no reporters. No bodyguards. No luxury event. Just two people sitting on an old wooden bench. "You know," he said with a smile, "everyone thinks you married me for my money." She laughed. "I married a man who couldn't even argue with me." "Fair point." He reached into his jacket pocket. "This time, I'd like to ask properly." He knelt on one knee, held out a simple ring. No cameras. No audience. Chisholm ease. He paused. "The woman who gave me my life back. Will you marry me because you actually want to?" She laughed through happy tears. "I was wondering when you'd finally ask." "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Instead of a lavish billionaire wedding, they chose a small ceremony at the same neighborhood church where Chisholm's mother had volunteered for years. Former hospital co-workers attended. The nurses who had cared for Obinna sat in the front row. Daniel smiled proudly from the second pew. Before exchanging vows, Obinna turned toward the guests. "My wife didn't save me because I was rich. She saved me because she believed every life mattered. I spent years building companies. She reminded me how to build a family." Together, they transformed part of the Okafor fortune into a charitable foundation that erased medical debt for families facing impossible choices. The first debt they forgave belonged to a single father whose daughter needed emergency heart surgery. When he broke down in tears, Chisholm quietly squeezed his hand. She remembered exactly how hopeless debt had once felt. She promised herself no family would have to choose between love and survival if she could help it. Years later, a young reporter asked Chisholm during an interview, "If you could change one thing about your past, would you refuse that forced marriage?" She smiled thoughtfully. "I'd change the lies." She looked toward Obinna, who was laughing with their two children across the garden. "But I'd never change the love that came after." Sometimes life begins with heartbreak. Sometimes it begins with a decision you never wanted to make. And sometimes, the greatest blessings arrive wearing the disguise of your darkest day. Because real love isn't built on wealth, power, or perfect beginnings. It's built by the person who stays, when everyone else has already walked away. The end.